Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Porter, Executive Vice President of the Porter Group. Porter Group is a bipartisan government affairs firm based here in Washington, D.C. Our team is made up of the best and the brightest in their field. I'll put our team up against anyone back here in D.C., and it's my honor to introduce a couple of those amazing team members. First off, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Walker, our Senior Vice President, and Benjamin Rosenbaum, who is our Vice President. Stephanie has been a legislative director for a Republican member of Congress who served on the House Appropriations Committee. I think she has 7 or 8 years of experience here on the Hill, maybe longer. Steph will correct me if I'm wrong. And then, of course, Ben, who was Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for a House Democrat. And I'm sorry that Stephanie worked for a Republican member on the Appropriations Committee. And Ben, he also worked for a Democrat senator. So collectively, 20 plus years of experience back here in DC. An absolute honor to have them with us today. At the Porter Group, one of our slogans is business and government solutions. But more importantly, it's about solutions for people. We never lose sight of that here at the Porter Group. And I think it's what makes us unique is that we have that people touch and we listen to what people have to say. Politics is not a perfect science. With that comes with a lot of noise, as you can see, watching TV, watching these commercials. And so what our job is to navigate through that uncertainty by listening and finding solutions. We help create pathways to success, no matter what the election's outcome may be. That's what we do, and that's what we love to do, and it's our passion. Our firm represents some of the top defense contractors in the world, major cities and counties, airports, developers, and most notably, top employers of people with disabilities. It's one of our passions. I really appreciate you joining us here today. Now I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie and Ben. They're going to go into more specific details of what the political environment is and what to expect heading into the next Congress. So please, Stephanie, Ben, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks for the intro. I think what we really want to get into to start off with is looking at what the actual results were for this midterm, right? I mean, it was kind of an unusual one, and we'll get into some of the quirkiness of this election, if we want to call it that. But we'll start. I'll let Ben take over real quick to talk about where are we? What's the result?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in a nutshell, kind of unexpected, depending on who you ask. But as it stands today, there's still some races still to be called, but as it stands today, Senate control is going to be maintained by the Democrats with 50 votes. The Republicans have captured 49 seats, but there is still one undecided race in the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia has a requirement that you must receive 50% of the electorate in order to win an election outright. If not, it moves to a runoff. So now the two top contenders for the Senate seat in Georgia, Herschel Walker, who's the challenger, and the incumbent, Raphael Warnock, are going to be in a runoff on December 6th, which will determine if the Democrats are able to increase their majority to 51 seats, or if it will remain a 50-50 split Senate with the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, the deciding vote in any kind of tie. So that's kind of what we're looking at on the Senate side. On the House side, just yesterday, we received word that they called the 218th race for the Republicans in California, and that gave the Republicans control of the House for the first time in many Congresses. Right now, there are 212 seats that have been decided for Democrats. There's still 6 undecided seats at the moment, with probably a likely split between them. There are about 2 seats where the Democrats are more favored to win, 2 seats where the Republicans are more favored to win, and a couple that could go either way. But the determination is that the Republicans have taken back the House, and so we're going to have a divided Congress as we move into the 118th.
Yeah, and a couple more just details on the unexpected results of this election. I think the rule became, the upset is there were no upsets. The incumbency really was strong this last midterm, which is unusual in a circumstance where the economy is suffering. Typically, voters will want to change. So to have such a strong incumbency is is not usual. I will say, I do think primaries were kind of where the battles were fought in this particular cycle, because we still are coming into a new Congress with about 75 new members so far, which is a healthy amount. It's lower than the last cycle, but still fairly sizable. And I think that's largely looking at where primaries are being the true battlefields in today's politics. But I will say, it was also really unusual that the Republicans got the popular vote, which, by the way, they actually don't very often at all, but to get it by 4.5%, which is the highest in history, is very strange to have such a modest seat pickup. And it really speaks to the difference between a popular democracy and a representative government. This is, and it's that percentage might drop a little bit as these races are being decided, but it's still probably going to be between 3 and 4. The most recent time this has happened was when the Democrats won the popular vote on the congressional ballot by 3.6% in 2008 when President Obama was running, but they actually did not control the Congress. They only got 59% of the seats. And I don't remember the makeup because it was too long ago, but they only got 59% of the seats. So it's the closest mirrored outcome to this. Typically, the margin in a popular vote on the generic congressional ballot, just looking across the board at how many votes each party got, typically it's less than 1% between the two. That's how closely America tends to be on our values. So for 4.5% is not only extremely high, but it's just so unusual that would not line up with the congressional mapping.
Well, one thing I will point out, Stephanie, sorry to interrupt.
Please,
you
go
mentioned
ahead.
sort of redistricting, you mentioned primaries. There were 16 incumbents who lost just during the primary process. And about almost half of those lost because they were running in seats that were 2 members running against each other. So you had an incumbent running against an incumbent. And this is sort of, we see this at times after a redistricting process where, a state like New York, for instance, or Connecticut, or Rhode Island may run, they may lose a seat, and then it forces 2 members to have to run against each other. So we did see a few members who lost during primaries. We saw a number of members who retired because they were going to have to face an incumbent versus incumbent type situation where it could be members of the same party. And so that is something we definitely see in that first kind of election after a redistricting process.
Yeah, and I think it's also, and I was looking at this in terms of that high popularity margin, because I think some of these battles were fought in primaries, there were circumstances where folks were running almost unopposed, more so on the Republican side than on the left, which can definitely change sort of vote numbers on there. So really interesting. And I wanted to mention Alaska really quick because it is also not a called race. The reason we don't talk about it much is because it's going to probably be a Republican senator. It depends on which one. They used a system called ranked choice, and we might get into that later if we have time, but they are still also outstanding between Shibaka and Murkowski, who are basically dead heat right now with the ranked choice system. So with that,
well, before we move, I did want to this sort of idea of the power of incumbency, because it really did play out in a lot of different ways around this election cycle. And perhaps it's not as surprising if we kind of look at the numbers. So Gallup, it's a national polling organization, pretty well respected, and they've been taking the temperature on, the president and Congress for decades now. And when I was looking at the polling of the Gallup organization about Congress, oftentimes people say, I hate Congress, but I love my congressman. And it's very evident if you look at the numbers of what Gallup was seeing across the country, save for the, immediate aftermath of 9/11, Congress's approval ratings are typically quite low. We're talking low 30% approval to low 20% approval. Going into these elections in the month leading up to the midterms, Gallup showed that 1 out of 5 registered voters supported Congress, approved of the job Congress, which is a terrible number, which would lead to the idea that a lot of incumbents may be pushed out, challengers may win. But when asked how people feel about their own member of Congress, the numbers are quite different. 53% of registered voters said they support their member of Congress, and only 44% said they do not support their member of Congress. And I think that's kind of evident if you look at the results of the election. Incumbents were able to win out in most of the races.
I think that margin is also really interesting looking at the margins of the close races, right? Because 53-44 is a little too diverse, but most of the tight races were within 3 percentage points, which is obviously so narrow a margin. So it's just that really mirrors the margin of victory. So with folks coming back, let's look at, I think there was a lot fun, or just some like fun new things happening with these election results, or at least interesting. I don't know if you want to call Congress fun ever, but like, for example, we have our first Generation Z congressman coming from Florida, Representative-elect Maxwell Frost, which that'll be interesting to see how that shakes everything up. But what other things did you see about some of the outcomes?
Yeah, there's a few notable folks who have come in. We have, the first time in over a decade, we have people who are related to each other who are serving in Congress together. More notably, it's the Robert Menendez Jr., who was elected to the House from New Jersey, will be serving alongside his father, who is the senator from New Jersey, Bob Menendez. We haven't seen that in quite a few years. We also have a number of former staffers from Congress, people who are familiar with how Congress works because they had either previously been employed or are currently employed until they decided to run for Congress. Katie Britt, who is the former chief of staff to retiring Alabama Senator Shelby. She won that seat in Alabama, becoming the first woman to serve in the Senate from Alabama. So she's taking on the seat of her former boss. Dan Goldman, who may be a familiar name for those who really paid attention to the impeachment hearings in the last Congress, or this current Congress. He was the chief counsel for the Democrats during that process. He won a House seat in New York State. We've got a former member of the cabinet, Ryan Zinke from Montana, won and was former Interior Secretary. And I could only think of one other recent example where a former member of the cabinet decided to run for the House of Representatives with Donna Shalala from Florida. So that's kind of notable. And then another thing I just saw, we talk about the red waves and these kind of movements that bring in new members of Congress into this body. Steve Shabbat of Ohio recently lost, was called a race. It was an unexpected loss for him. He's the last remaining House member from the Gingrich Republican Revolution of 1994, which was a notable wave that brought in a whole host of new members to Congress, created a lot of headaches for the Clinton administration, but he was the last remaining member of that, currently serving the House. There's a couple still in the Senate, but yeah, those are a few notable folks. And I think one other area that we've seen some growth in recent years was the representation of women in Congress. For the first time in quite a while, we didn't see increases in the number of women representing. We're still kind of going to be around that 25% margin of women representatives in Congress. But yeah, so sort of a little bit of a plateau there. But Marcy Kaptur of Ohio was surprisingly won re-election in a race where she was redistricted in a more difficult district. She now becomes the longest serving woman in Congress, eclipsing Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, who served for 40 years.
And so we have this cast of characters, and they're headed to Washington. They've had their little orientation already, but they don't get sworn until January. But even with that, they still have to kind of plan for the future. So they're going to come back probably a majority of, it could be 219 to 217, which would be the closest in modern history. If you guys remember, speaking of the Gingrich era, I think it's at least close. Well, it's a little after, I think, but the closest second to that would be 2001. Mm-hmm. And then before that, 1953, which was 221, both tied. So I don't even think anyone in modern history knows what that means to have a margin that close. So we'll see whether it's kind of going to break two ways, right? Either you want to pass some things, so you're going to have to kind of go central for a bipartisan move, or you're just going to be so deeply partisan you can never have anybody waver, so you never pass anything the whole time. So that's kind of the two different ways. But first things first, they've gotten back to town, and before they can even think about that, the two parties have to go to their corners and figure out who's going to be in charge. So I'll touch on Republicans really quick, and then I'll hand it over to you for the Senate Democrats. Sure. And Republicans, I suppose. The House Republicans met this week to talk about leadership. Also, we just had a major announcement from the Democrats. I'll let Ben handle, but the House Republicans had multiple candidates running for their party leader, which is likely to be Speaker. Kevin McCarthy did get the amount of support he needed to be nominated. A Speaker has to be voted on the floor. So he will go to the floor as the nominee for Speaker for the House. And he will be his party leader regardless of that vote. There was also decisions being made on rules. The Republican conference got through the first half of their rule change proposals. There was 24 rule change proposals. They got through 12. Probably the later half are going to be a little more contentious. They're waiting till after Thanksgiving. The one that I think we're all waiting for with bated breath is whether or not they're going to continue community-directed spending or earmarks. So that's going to be probably a hard-fought one. But
and Stephanie, on that one, I did look up just some facts on where kind of things have fallen on community project funding, earmarks, community congressionally directed spending, whatever we want to call them now. In 2021, the House Republicans did reverse their position on earmarks and did vote to allow that to move forward. That was inside. They did not release the details on how many Republicans voted which way, but just sort of a note of telling of kind of where the conference is today. For this current year, the bill that we're still kind of working through and hope to get passed in the next few weeks, 60% of House Republican conference requested earmarks, and they accounted for about 40% of the overall funds in the bill. So there is a plurality, a majority of Republicans who are supporting earmarking, but time will tell if things have kind of changed, especially with the divided government, some of the fiscal concerns you raised at the beginning of this conversation, how that might play out as they kind of have this conversation internally.
And I think they will go ahead and keep them, Ben, if I'm guessing, because here's what they do. Here's what's different process-wise for everybody. When they're voting on laws, when they're going to vote on Speaker, that is for the people. That has to be public. There's a record of that. You will know who voted for what. When they're just voting on party rules, which are just really guidelines that they're setting amongst themselves, they're absolutely anonymous, closed door voting, largely even behind the closed door, strictly voice, literally you raise your hand and they count it, not so that there's no record of how anyone voted. So nobody feels scared to vote their mind, right? So that's why I do think they'll keep them, because I think when you put the politics aside, it actually is a very functional way to get communities in their district the funding they need.
Absolutely. And then the alternative is you have the Biden administration, who you would assume folks in the House Republican Conference aren't too excited about handing over a blank check to the Biden administration to make these fiscal decisions. So that, and the fact that the Senate Democrats are going to maintain earmarks, you don't want to be the folks handing the dollars over to the Senate Democrats. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot of forces that are in play that are going to support continuation of the earmark process in some form or fashion.
And speaking of Democrats, we have a big shake happening over in the House, of course. Speaker Pelosi, who is the only woman speaker ever, is looking like she's going to take a step back. So Ben, take it away. What's happening with Democrats?
Yeah, so this afternoon, Speaker Pelosi came to the House floor. She was waiting for the decision of who will be in charge of Congress, the House next year, when yesterday they called that 218th race, as I mentioned. She would then become minority leader in the next Congress. But there was a quick question of whether or not she would stay in this Congress, stay in their leadership position, or if she would step aside for a new generation. And so this afternoon, the speaker took to the floor and announced that she is going to stay within the Congress, but she is going to step aside from her role as speaker. Just a little personal note, because I came in 2007 following that 2006 election, which brought her the gavel. So it is bittersweet for a lot of Democrats. There's whether or not you support her politics, it's hard to argue that she wasn't an effective leader for the Democrats. It's kind of evident when you just look at the attack ads on Democrats running in the cycle. More often than not, you see Nancy Pelosi front and center in a lot of those ads. So you must be doing something right to be kind of the boogie person. So she has decided to step aside. Similarly, Steny Hoyer, who is currently majority leader, number 2 in the House leadership, has decided he will also remain in Congress, but step aside from his leadership position. And so there is a new slate of Democratic leaders who are expected to be kind of 1, 2, and 3 on that side. Hakeem Jeffries from New York City is kind of heir apparent and has received the support of current leaders within the Democratic Party. He's quite popular and pretty involved with Congressional Black Caucus and Progressive Caucus, and has a lot of respect and a pretty effective fundraiser. Number 2 in that position is likely to be Kathleen Clark of Massachusetts. She's currently assistant whip. And then number 3 would be Pete Aguilar of California. And I think when you look at sort of the folks who are in those positions and rising into those positions, having a prominent African-American, a woman, and a member of the Hispanic community is pretty representative of the Democratic Party as it stands today. So that's kind of the new generation of folks who are going to come in, and we'll see some other new faces in this next Congress as well.
So over in the Senate Republicans were also having their leadership elections, which were all, I would say, more contentious probably than the McCarthy election. There was some dissatisfaction amongst conference and caucus members on the leadership specifically of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and in turn, Minority Leader McConnell. In the end, McConnell was victorious. It was 37-11, 37, actually, I think one person abstained, but 37-11 for his victory. That's a hand count. It was anonymous. I don't know who did what, but he was challenged by Florida Senator Rick Scott on that, but ultimately was successful. I think that speaks to a lot of things. First of all, I think that when you're coming in the minority and you're coming in with such close margins, it's really not valuable to you to have upheaval in your leadership. But also, like Ben was just talking about with Speaker Pelosi, there's politics to Mitch McConnell, right? But he is still the person who controls the purse. And then, it's risky to have a huge upheaval in that when there's sort of a built-in system for these election supports. The other leaders are going to be John Thune for whip, Montana's Steve Daines for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and then Iowa's Joni Ernst for policy chair, and West Virginia's Shelley Moore Capito for vice chairwoman. So, it's a lot of the folks we know. I think the new one here will be Daines, which is always nice to see. That'll be Western leadership in both the House and the Senate, which I think anyone from the Western United States can appreciate because it does not always happen.
And I think it's also telling, his counterpart in the Senate, the other Montana Senator, John Tester, a Democrat, is up for election in 2024, where Democrats are going to have to defend a number of seats that are in states that Donald Trump won, more Republican-leaning seats. So it is certainly telling where you see, sort of the representation of the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee and kind of what that means in terms of recruitment against some of the Democratic incumbents, and we'll, the race for 2024 is already underway before we even have finished deciding 2022.
It's already started. It's already here. Now, the Senate Democrats have not had their leadership discussions yet, have they?
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. So this is going to follow. They've kind of waited, allowed the Republicans to kind of go first out the gate, especially with the House Republicans taking on the leadership. Senate Democrats are going to take up their elections at the end of this month, the beginning of next month, and the House Democrats will kind of have their process the beginning of December as well. So things are kind of lining up for that process, but they allowed the Republicans to kind of go first in this process.
And I forgot, because one kind of big piece that the Republicans did vote for was reopening access to their side of the Capitol. They won't be able to. The Senate will have to make their own decisions on that, I believe, but at least the House office buildings and the House side of the Capitol, they want public access to be restored. Right now, there is limited public access. There's basically a system of, you have to have a staff escort. Yeah. It is pretty clunky, I won't lie, but I know folks have their reasons. So the House Republicans want to be over that and reopen it. So they did approve that piece. So other than rules, so looking at the next Congress, finishing out this year and looking at next year, what do we think this means with the results they are. You can take it away.
Yeah, so now it's kind of okay. We've gotten these election results, and what do we expect sort of the agenda to be in the next Congress? I've been having some conversations with a lot of folks, and if you just start kind of watching the news as of late, you're seeing an uptick, especially among House Republicans, of we are going to be in charge. We're going to have the gavels in committees, and with such a closely divided Congress, and with the factions within the Republican Party being as they are, where you've got some divisions, you've got some of the same challenges Nancy Pelosi faced from the left, McCarthy and the Republican leaders are going to have to face from the right. It's going to be difficult to find sort of that middle ground unless they do decide to kind of shift towards the center, if they are going to have to and kind of find that middle ground. So, it may turn a little bit more investigative rather than legislative. We saw this morning the incoming chair of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee announced that he is kind of leading the effort to investigate the Biden family. So sort of speaking to some of the things that you'd heard about in the campaign trail in the last couple of years, dating back to President Biden being sworn in. There's certainly been an uptick of letters to the administration related to COVID relief and COVID response by the Biden administration, decisions by the CDC and Dr. Fauci, of decisions and the implementation of the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. I think some oversight and investigations into how the IRS is going to spend some of the money related to increasing their staffing levels. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more of these sort of oversight, quote unquote, hearings in the next Congress. We're sort of seeing the promise on that. But there are some big legislative issues that Congress is going to have to tackle regardless. Chief among them is just keeping the government operating. So there's going to have to be some give and take and negotiation.
Let me pause you really quick. How many shutdowns do you think we're going to have next year? Do we think it's over 2 or...
I mean, I would like to say 0 because my hope is that cooler heads prevail, but we're going to have to see how that all plays out. But first, we got to get through December 15th, which is the current deadline for keeping the government operating. We're working our way towards that now. But then looking into next year, it is going to be tough because Congress, even under one-party rule, has been difficult to get appropriations bills passed in a regular order, and they've had to go to this omnibus process to get everything jammed into one bill, which requires negotiations because you still got to get those 60 votes in the Senate. So it does give Mitch McConnell a little bit more leverage than he may have previously had, because that's going to be the person that Democrats are going to have to go to negotiate. The Biden administration has already said, if we need to go to Congress for something, we're speaking to Mitch McConnell. They're not speaking to McCarthy. So I think that that's kind of telling even early out, but it is going to be interesting on that front. There are also a couple of other bills. We do the annual defense authorization, which typically is something that is more bipartisan. So we'll see how that kind of plays out in the next Congress with new leadership in the House. And then we've got a couple of other major reauthorization bills. The Federal Aviation Administration reauthorization is expiring next September. I'll note that this is a bill that has been at times very difficult to pass. Just 2 reauthorizations ago, we were in a period where they had 24 extensions over the course of 2 years in order to pass an FAA reauthorization. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on. But another big one, and this is one that doesn't really cut as much along party lines, more on regional issues, is the Farm Bill. And this is a big bill that deals with everything from agricultural policy, ag markets, as well as nutrition programs. So it's something that it impacts both rural and urban districts. We've got a number of Republicans who won in sort of swingier seats or more urban and suburban districts, especially around New York State, and New York City. So you're going to have a number of folks who kind of are in that little more middle of the road problem solvers type members of Congress who are going to have a lot of interest in getting some of these bills done because and we talked about redistricting earlier and the race for 2024 already being underway. New York State, where Democrats lost a number of seats where they were likely to win because of Joe Biden's results in 2020, there is going to be another redistricting process in New York State because the current maps they utilized for this election were court ordered, and they now have to go back and see if they can redo the maps and get through that process. So there is some potential for Democrats to claw back some of those seats. So some of those Republican members that just won are going to be looking for wins early in this Congress.
So I also think, one thing that I don't think many people are talking about is the situations we have abroad are escalating. And I think that the foreign affairs committees on both sides of Senate and the House are going to have a lot of work on their hands. Those issues tend to become bipartisan depending on what's happening. But right now, I don't have a lot of faith in total bipartisanship on those issues because, we have the situation in Ukraine right now, which was once, I would say, strongly bipartisan, the decision to support Ukraine, excuse me. But they, that's kind of deteriorating. So I don't, I think that the Foreign Affairs Committee members are going to be in the spotlight in a much bigger way than we have seen probably in 6 years, as that situation continues to escalate. And we have situations with major powers like China that are kind of escalating. I mean, with our chips legislation, with even issues like
situation
TikTok
in Taiwan
are coming up. Cryptocurrency is becoming. There's a lot of things that aren't quite full, military hostilities, but they are becoming quite tense between our nations, and I don't think that's going away. Speaker Pelosi going to Taiwan, that was, and then other members followed after her. What's interesting, though, is that especially on the House side, the Foreign Affairs Committee members, I don't think for any particular reason, huge number of turnover. It's quite a few people have left, lost, being replaced. So we're going to have a fresh crop of foreign affairs experts, and the people who've been there longer are really going to need to step in on some mentorship there, because I think we're going to be hearing, I think a lot of air is going to be taken out of the room on foreign conflicts in the next couple of
absolutely. And you add to the list the situation in Iran, the renegotiation of the JCPOA. I mean, there's a whole host of things. They're all kind of linked. A lot of these countries have direct links or indirect links. And so all of these situations are certainly something that will be challenges for the Biden administration. And Republicans are going to be raising a lot of questions about how the administration is addressing some of these issues. And just the issues of climate change. We saw that there was the big conference just last week that the administration attended. That's certainly going to be part and parcel of some of these oversight hearings and just the issues dealing. And you're seeing Democrats also raise some questions about some of the decisions the administration has made on some of these fronts. So not to add anything else to the politics, but even though the World Cup in Qatar is a political issue in itself, just because of some of the issues, it's shining kind of a light on some of our relationships with the Gulf states and some of our partnerships there. There was some incidents, some intelligence questions. And so I think there's going to be a whole with this new crop of members coming in, some changes in leadership. It's going to raise a lot of questions and to your point, put a big focus on our interactions around the world.
Yeah, and it's, you bring up the Gulf states or the Gulf countries. Energy is it's not resolved. I mean, there's an energy crisis here, everywhere, globally. It's interesting because we're kind of facing a looming recession with an energy crisis, which is scary for everyone. We feel it too, but so is everybody else in the world. So there's almost kind of just like a relativity issue happening.
Absolutely.
But certainly that is going to influence some of these global affairs activities that Congress is going to have to deal with. So, so with that, do we have, since I think we have a minute of time, I wanted to circle back and talk about what is right choice. But before I do that, Ben, did you have any sort of concluding thoughts on?
I did see in the Q&As that we did get a question related to election integrity and kind of what these elections kind of say about that. And just a quick point to that, you did see a number of particularly people who are running for governor, people who are running for Secretary of State, which administer these elections at the state level, those who kind of endorse this idea that our elections are rigged in some way or you can't trust the results of them. The vast majority, if not all of those candidates ended up losing those races. And we did not see a lot of issues, long lines, a lot of concerns being raised on either side about the results of this election. I think it is kind of telling that we may be kind of turning the page a bit in terms of that talking point and what that means for 2024. Republicans winning the House, I think it's hard for them to be able to then point to the fact that Democrats won some governorships that maybe they weren't expecting, or that maybe were able to maintain the Senate. So I think that kind of argument is kind of falling a little bit by the wayside. There's certainly some folks who are continuing to raise that flag, but most of them are not going to be in positions to actually influence that process.
Oh, and here's what we'll say also about the congressional role in that process is that I don't think that congressional Republicans are eager to take the mantle on election reform when it is so traditional. It is a state right per the Constitution. And if you just looking ideologically at a Republican constitutionalist, right, I don't think they want to scrape election integrity into the federal basket. So I think that remain a state by state issue where state voters will need to bring those concerns to their state electeds. But another question we got was on when they're going to announce committee leadership. December is what we're hearing, early December. So after the Thanksgiving break.
And just inside baseball, there's like an internal process. We've got these steering committees that both the Republicans and the Democrats have. That's the process by which they decide who's going to run the committees. We're not going to see a ton of change. There's a few notable exceptions. I'll note one is with some Senate retirements. For the first time in history, we're going to have 4 women in charge, both chair and ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. Arguably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful committees in Congress. So that's going to be a little bit of a change. There's one notable race on the House side for Democrats when it comes to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, retirement of Pete DeFazio from Oregon. You've got Eleanor Holmes Norton versus Rick Larson of Washington. And that's going to be a race for some folks to watch, especially if they are to move on this FAA reauthorization. I think there's maybe a couple of other issues they've got to work through on the House Republican side in terms of potential waivers for leadership for a couple of chairmanships. But I don't think we're going to see a ton of major surprises when it comes to the committee chairs. Now, within the subcommittees, we may see some movement. But
so, and I know we have several Source America folks on, so I'll address Virginia Fox is seeking to be chairwoman of Education and Labor. The Republicans have set a rule on themselves that they term out. So she has to seek a waiver from her leadership. Democrats don't do that. So that's why they have it's just different for them. But my intel's pretty good for Congresswoman Fox. So we'll see what happens. But she's at least being seriously considered on getting that waiver. So we'll find that out early December, which is good because she's very familiar. If you're a Source America listener, she's very familiar with the program. So that would be good news. But Mr. Wahlberg is the person who would be next, and he's also a good ally. So kind of good options either way. Now, the Republicans might change the name of the committee back to Education and Workforce, because that goes back and forth. There's a spat between whether we call it labor or workforce.
Yeah, so. And I assume oversight will go back to oversight and reform rather than
reform. Right.
Yeah, government. I forgot what the Democrats changed it to, but we will see some changes in the names. But jurisdiction.
Not that it matters, right?
Right.
So on OGR too, you mentioned this, but I'll just touch on it again. The investigations are definitely going to ramp up. And on the question of election integrity, it is possible that they'll do something like that in OGR, where they do some more investigative type work. So I would not mean to completely dismiss that it's going to leave the political narrative or ether or anyone's thoughts and minds. But I think that, not to say what Congress does is all political, but I think in that particular committee, they're probably going to be looking to what the sentiment of their base voters are at the time to make a decision on what they're investigating. So could be lots of things, and probably will change as the year progresses too. I will just very quickly ranked choice, because it is sweeping the nation. And a few states have just adopted it as well. What it means is that every state does it differently. So this is essentially what it means, is that you go in and you list your 1 through, let's say, 3 or 4 candidates. And you go, okay, this is my first pick, this is my second pick, and this is my third pick. And what happens is they look at a raw total of whoever gets of the totals of who got first pick. And that's what they look at. That's the raw numbers you see. Like if you're looking at the Alaska race, that's what you're seeing. And then the system goes through and eliminates the last place person until that top vote getter gets 51%. So let's say you've got 4 candidates, A, B, C, D, and the the candidate D has the last place vote. So you eliminate those votes entirely. And then you look at who voted for that, those voters that you eliminated, who was their second place vote. And then you assign those until someone has 51%. Mm-hmm. It can be a little confusing because some states do it a little differently, because you might ask me the question, what if no one ever gets to 51%? That would be really rare to happen. But each state resolves that differently. Mm-hmm. And also it kind of gets into, it would almost never matter what your third place choice was in America. That might matter in countries that don't have such strong party systems, but in America, it does not matter. This kind of system would definitely impact areas that have a heavily one-sided party majority in their constituency. In the tight races, the result is going to look almost exactly like it looks now, because you would not rank, like a voter would not rank the other person second, they just will leave it blank. So it would look really similar, but except independents, which gives them a little more voice.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, that's kind of what's leading a lot of this in the states. We saw this, we're seeing it play out in Maine, we're seeing it play out in Alaska. This is kind of their second time around on these. But even Nevada voters just approved a ranked choice system. Now that requires another revote in the next election. We'll see how that kind of plays out. But we're seeing more and more of that, especially in states where there's a larger independent or non-affiliated voter populace, because those folks don't get to participate in the primary system in most places. Most places only have a party primary. They don't have an open primary. We've got California has a jungle primary. So you do sometimes have two Republicans who are the top finalists or two Democrats. But for the most part, you're seeing independents across the country who are unable to participate until the general election and are helping kind of push this idea that, you know, we want to be part of this process as well. And so you've got the parties kind of pushing back on it, independents and non-affiliated voters increasingly liking this idea that, like, well, you know, I don't vote party, I vote for the people I like best. So you're starting to see a little bit more interest in this ranked choice process. And I think we're going to see more and more states adopt this idea in the coming years.
And it is interesting to me to see it play out in Alaska, because if you recall, Senator Murkowski won her race on a write-in campaign, which is it almost never happens. So this sort of highlights that there was an appetite in Alaska where almost certainly a Republican gets elected, right, for Senate, that they wanted choices. And so this kind of gives them a choice to have multiple Republicans or whatever on the ballot that they can choose from. Like maybe they like, let's say Murkowski best, Chewbacca second best, third person, not, you know, and that helps them be able to have more than one option, no matter if it's a hugely one-sided constituency or not. So I'm not, by the way, not endorsing it. I have no idea if it works or not, but that's the arguments behind it and why people are using it.
Works.
I think, and with that, we can wrap up. Any last minute questions? Okay, then just like you guys, we'll see what happens. We'll be checking back in.
And I think Chris is going to close us out.
Oh, Chris, great.
Sorry, guys. That was absolutely amazing. Lot to unpack there. I hope everyone on the chat agrees that this is an amazing team. What a dynamic duo. It's great to see that we can bring a Republican and Democrat together and talk about issues and understand elections and getting both sides in perspectives of what's going on in DC and in the world. But again, thank you both. Absolutely incredible. It was, you know, we bring it all around to the people. It's about the people, and it's people what matters. And again, that's what separates the Porter Group, I think, from a lot of other firms out there. Of course, I may be a little biased, but I appreciate everyone attending today. We are also seeking our Politics Aside. We'd like to, you know, continue that. And we're seeking different topic items that anyone would be interested in hearing about. So please shoot us messages. I know that Rachel put on the chat that you can sign up to our newsletter, Politics Aside podcast that Congressman Porter does. But again, we look forward to hearing from everyone. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Bye.